The rules were simple. Don't rent any of these homes in this area to blacks. End of discussion. But if there was one thing that would make whites break this rule, it was money. Money in conjunction with individualism. Now let's see how this worked in Chicago. We're studying from the 1945 book, Black Metropolis by sociologists St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton. Service. It is in middle-class white neighborhoods adjacent to Negro communities, when a mass invasion is feared, that antagonisms become most highly organized. That's when whites began to resist, become hostile, and come together on one accord to do so. Such spots become contested areas. They become the battlegrounds. There were several such areas in Midwest Metropolis on the eve of the Second World War. The Commission on Race Relations had warned in 1920 against the enforced segregation of Negroes. By 1930, such measures had become so widespread, however, that 3/4 of all the residential property in the city was bound by restrictive covenants. What's a restrictive covenant? In this instance, it's a private agreement that limits the use of property. HOAs contain restrictive covenants. They tell you the colors that you can use on your house, the types of fence that you can install, the types of pets you can have, etc. But the clause contained in the 3/4 of all residential property in Chicago said this: it could not be rented or sold to Negroes. That was the restriction placed on the property. No Negroes allowed, point blank, period. Negroes have attacked the validity of these covenants in the courts and attempted to have state laws passed declaring them against the public policy, but without success. Tension over competition for living space since 1925 reached its highest point in 1938 in the form of a court battle to break the restrictive covenants in an area adjacent to the Black Belt, the Washington Park subdivision. The story is revealing. By 1937, the Negro population had so expanded as to leave 1 square mile, the Washington Park district, surrounded on 3 sides by Negroes. This district was referred to as the White Island. That's right here on this map. You can see that Negroes surrounded 3 sides of White Island. This invasion looked almost like a military ambush to them. Negroes flanking them from left and right and pressing in from the west. Whites began to feel trapped, and that's why their hostility became organized. Most of the owners of 1- and 2-family dwellings in the area had joined the Woodlawn Property Owners League, which encouraged them to sign covenants barring Negroes from renting or buying their property. That was the strategy, because many Negroes were still arriving into Chicago, and the Black Belt was becoming overcrowded. And once that happened, then where would blacks go next? You guessed it, the white neighborhood. So they used the restrictive covenant as their tool to lock the front door on Negroes and keep them out. Over 95% of the frontage was reported covered by restrictive covenants. The frontage is the location of properties facing the streets. 95% of them were in cahoots, all in agreement not to sell to Negroes. This bastion was first breached when several well-to-do Negroes managed to persuade 1 or 2 white property owners to sell. One of the whites broke the oath. They didn't keep their end of the bargain, and they sold out the community. The owners who sold contended that by the terms of the covenant, it was valid only if 95% of the frontage was covered, and that not enough owners had signed to make the instrument binding. So because enough people had not signed the covenant, in their mind, the covenant didn't apply to them. They saw an opportunity to make a few dollars, so they sold to Negroes, and they turned their back on the community. That's what individualism will do. The Property Owners Association then filed an injunction restraining one of the Negroes from occupying the property he had bought. The Chicago Title and Trust Company refused to give him a clear title. When the Negro purchaser carried the matter to the courts, the state Supreme Court upheld the Property Owners Association. So even though he bought the property fair and square, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the association. Now pay attention. This is why whites had to use the government to back them. They had too many individually minded people in their group for them to be able to uphold these agreements without judicial interference. There were too many backstabbers and cutthroat people in that community, so they relied on the government to compensate for that. By this time, the case was becoming a national cause célèbre among Negroes. The NAACP prepared to present the case to the United States Supreme Court. The lines were tightly drawn. National real estate magazines declared the case would set a precedent for all northern communities and called on member organizations to watch it with care. Money-raising campaigns were opened in the Negro community, and Negro newspapers all over the country began to comment on the significance of the case. Meantime, some of the larger white real estate companies with an eye for business began to break the covenants. You hear that? White real estate agents with money on their mind. Their allegiance was to the almighty dollar, and they were willing to sell out the community to get it. They had a whole bunch of them in that community who thought on an individual level. And that's what further accelerated the downfall of white supremacy, as we'll see, especially as we move along forward in the historical records. But at this point, whites had covenants to ban Negroes, and the white real estate agents had desires to break them. They moved Negroes into 1 or 2 apartment buildings, immediately raising the rents by from 20 to 50%. How? Because Negroes were desperate. They needed places to stay, and they were willing to pay more. And the city affairs are always in motion, just like everything else. And it lined up just right to open a window of opportunity to profit off of the Negro situation. Whoever could see that opportunity was in the position to take it and was willing to take it, did so. That's exactly what some white real estate agents did. In 1940, there were many cases of whites and Negroes living in the same building, the latter paying, for equivalent accommodations, rentals much higher than those paid by the whites. In such cases, the realtors were urging the white families to leave so that their apartments could be rented to Negroes at a higher rate. The smaller property owners were then pressed to sell their property to the realtors because
the neighborhood was going colored and the value of their investments would fall anyhow.
Some owners, seeing the economic advantage, preferred to sell or rent to Negroes directly. Here it comes. But these owners were in a dilemma. If they sold to Negroes and broke the covenants, the property owners' associations would challenge the transactions. Whereas, if they did not sell to Negroes, either they would find themselves stranded in all Negro communities, unable because of the covenants to rent any portion of their property to Negroes, or they would have to sell at a loss to the larger real estate companies. So sell and risk the transaction being challenged. Don't sell and be stuck with all Negroes, or sell at a loss to a larger real estate company. This was a very tough decision here for a lot of them. As they became aware of this dilemma, the Small Property Owners Associated Incorporated came into being. The organization described itself as
a mutually incorporated body, organized solely for the express object of seeking immediate relief from the present existing impractical and now highly injurious exactions of the so-called restrictive covenant.
The covenants were financially restricting them, and basically they wanted out. It did not attack restrictive covenants on principle, nor indicate that the members wished to live in Negro neighborhoods, because they most certainly didn't want to do that. Let's be clear. They just didn't want to uphold a covenant that was costing them money. Covenants were now considered economically disadvantageous, and their espousal was simply called blind loyalty to a losing cause. Why a losing cause? Because there was always someone willing to sell out the community. Blacks were still moving in. And for these smaller property owners, the hassle, in addition to losing money, just wasn't worth it anymore. Antagonism was focused on high-priced East End attorneys, a reference to the University of Chicago area, sponsored by funds from a non-resident property owners league, which allegedly,
during the past several years, has been actuated solely by a motive to assure the maintenance of white residential supremacy. regardless of the great financial detriment, mental anguish, and impracticability of those owners within said subdivision, to further withstand the devastating losses sustained through the vainly impotent racial rental restrictions exacted by that non-residential body.
That just means they wanted to keep the neighborhood white. It wasn't working. People were losing money, but they kept pushing it anyways out of plain stubbornness. The shoe was pinching, meaning they felt the pressure. The NAACP, which had been preparing the case for the United States Supreme Court, enlisted the aid of this white small property owners group. A brief filed by the white lawyer reveals how the white supremacy dogmas disintegrated under the pressure of economic necessity.
Your plaintiffs further allege that in view of the large Negro occupancy in said area, there are only a certain class of the poor white people that desire to remain there, that they are poor rent payers, careless with the upkeep and care of property, and will pay only very low rentals, and that said property cannot be operated at a profit. Your plaintiffs further allege that the Negro tenants pay substantially larger rentals and permit the buildings to be maintained from the income of said property, that the buildings now classed as white properties are not maintaining themselves and will result in ultimate financial ruin and loss of property.
When the case was carried to the Supreme Court, a ruling was handed down which, in effect, constituted a victory for the Negroes. Who ruled in favor of Negroes? Whites did. All this is chipping away at the system of white supremacy, little by little. Pay attention. Anytime you see one of these court case victories like this, it's demonstrating how that ideology has been slowly breaking down. It took a long time to build up, and as a result, it takes time to destruct. But by the time it does, an entirely new ideology would have replaced it. That's just how the world works in its ever-changing nature. The court did not rule that restrictive covenants were invalid, but it did state that each parcel of property in the area constituted a specific individual case, and that no decision against one owner for renting or selling to a Negro constituted a precedent binding others. So it's promoting individualism amongst the owners. They basically could do what they wanted. If they wanted to rent to Negroes, they could. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to. It wasn't a neighborhood rule anymore. It was every man for himself. The cost of fighting several hundred cases through the courts every time a violation occurred would have bankrupted the Woodlawn Property Owners League. When such a crisis has arisen and Negro invasion is imminent, the residents must face the choice of remaining in the area with Negroes, of selling at a low rate to the larger real estate companies, of selling to Negroes in violation of the covenant, or of fighting the covenants. All options that kept whites up late at night pondering. During the period of tension, a white interviewer talked with a representative group of property owners living in the White Island. It was found that a few of these people were very bitter toward Negroes, and a few were apparently willing to live beside Negroes as neighbors, while the largest number expressed no hostility toward Negroes as such, but wanted to sell to them at a profit and move. Most of the extreme antagonism toward Negroes was expressed by people who definitely planned to leave, but the anti-Negro diehards were a minority, even within this group. The following statements are typical of those made by persons planning to move.
I'm not prejudiced, but I'd burn this building down before I'd sell it to any damned
I don't want to bring my children up among Negroes, but where can people go in this city to keep away from Negroes?
There are just too many colored people here now.
The last quotation represents the reason most frequently given by persons planning to leave the neighborhood. The comments of the few individuals who planned to remain in the area were more varied.
Why move? Negroes will be in all neighborhoods after a while.
I don't mind some colored neighbors so long as the neighborhood isn't all colored.
We've owned this house for years. I think the Negroes in here should be allowed to stay, but no more should come in.
The people in here just fear intermarriage, that's all. And they're crazy. We need more government housing for Negroes.
The largest group, the undecided, provided an even greater variety of reactions.
The rich Negroes get along all right in this neighborhood.
Before the mob started coming, the Negroes in here were good neighbors. I'm not prejudiced against them, but a Negro man held me up the other day. I'm scared to stay here.
I don't know about covenants. It doesn't seem worth all our time and money to fight for them. We can make good money by dealing with Negroes.
We struggled hard to get this home. I'm going to stay as long as I can, but if Negroes move in all over the place, everything we worked for will be lost.
It isn't logical to keep restrictive covenants if the only way some people can make money is to rent to Negroes. There's nothing to do but stay here and face the problem. I think real estate is a better investment here than in the suburbs.
I'd rather have good Negro neighbors than some of the white trash that's coming in as the Negroes come. But I feel lost in this neighborhood now.
The last quotation is of particular interest because it contains two sentiments that were widely prevalent among the white residents of the neighborhood. The first was the feeling, and it seemed to be a fact, that the area was deteriorating irrespective of the influx of Negroes, i.e., in terms of new undesirable white residents and of the physical appearance of the community. So the undesirables like the Greeks, Russians, and Poles were tearing up the neighborhood. And that's before Negroes arrived. This stuff is wild out here. The second sentiment, even more universal and present among persons who were going to move out of the neighborhood as well as those who planned to remain or were undecided as to their course of action, seems extremely significant. Most of the white people did not object to the presence of a few Negroes, but they were very much afraid that they, as individual white families, would become completely isolated in a Negro area. We've talked about it before. A few Negroes in some cases were tolerable to them. It may not have been ideal, but it was tolerable. But once too many of them came in, it became a real concern. As to how much objection white people would have to living in neighborhoods with a few Negroes of similar socioeconomic status, there is no certain evidence. As we have seen, there are such mixed neighborhoods in Midwest metropolis. Yet in an opinion poll taken by Fortune magazine for the Carnegie Myrtle study of the Negro in America, from 77 to 87% of the informants in various sections of the country declared themselves in favor of residential segregation. Such uniform expression of opinion throughout the country suggests that the thought of having Negroes as neighbors is very distasteful, though experience shows that many people who in answer to a direct question will oppose Negro neighbors would not use violence to evict them and might ultimately come to accept them, which for some Negroes would have been a dream come true. A lifelong aspiration finally becoming a reality for them. Right? It's wild out here. So that's the short piece on the racial restrictive covenants in Chicago. We have a lot more to cover, so make sure to stay tuned, okay? I thank you right now for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.